Relax now. You feel the softness beneath you, the gentle rise and fall of your chest, the calm settling into every limb. Let your surroundings drift into stillness, the hush of a room by candlelight. The soft crackle of a hearth, a distant breeze rustling through bamboo leaves outside a window. Our story today begins at the waning edge of China's proud Qing Empire dynasty of sweeping rivers, jade palaces, and centuries of harmony on the cusp of change, or shadows gathering where once sunlight reigned. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, China under the Qing was vast and prosperous. The imperial courts sat elevated among carved red pillars, marble terraces, and lush gardens where blossoms drifted like pink snow petals over still ponds. Lanterns glowed at dusk, their reflections dancing across water, while the scent of sandalwood lingered in corridors. In those halls, scholars read ancient classics, generals surveyed frontiers, peasants tilled rice fields and terraces, and merchants moved goods along winding canals. All seemed balanced, a world held in graceful equilibrium. But beyond the grandeur, a quiet tide crept in, one that would bring upheaval. It moved through smoke and trade, through ships crossing distant seas, through whispers of addiction and greed. It was opium, the bitter leaf turned into powder, burned and inhaled first by a few, then by many. And as it spread, so did the cracks in the empire's foundation. Imagine a smoky room in Canton or Guangzhou. Low wooden tables stained with tea, men gathered in dim light, opium pipes passed slowly, the fragrant, heavy smoke curling upward. The air tastes bitter, heavy with the scent of burning resin. In distant provinces, fields lie fallow as farmers turn to poppies, lured by wealth, choking the life from their soil. Silk and tea shipments continue outward, but silver begins its slow drift away, leaving coffers lighter, rulers worried. Outside in the countryside, soft wind flows through rice paddies. Water buffaloes graze by earthen walls. Women shell rice, children chase dragonflies. Beneath this peace, hunger grows. Tax levies rise to compensate for silver lost to foreign traders. Corruption seeps in. Local officials accept bribes, and the people suffer in silence. This is a tale of subtle tragedies, where small choices and hidden dependencies accumulate into great collapse. In the imperial court, grand counselors debate. Should we ban the trade, confiscate the opium, impose harsh laws? But foreign powers press treaties, demand trade rights. Cannon smoke, British demands, diplomatic pressure, they bear down like a storm long foretold. The Qing rulers are torn between tradition and the tide of modernity. They hold the ancient scrolls and call upon virtue, yet see power shifting beyond their grasp. So our stage is set, gardens and grand halls, rippling rivers and humble fields, the silent pull of opium and the murmur of dissent. What follows is a journey through greed, suffering, resistance, and transformation. Our story drifts forward, like a slow boat gliding down the Pearl River under a sky of muted stars. The water shimmers, lanterns sway from wooden masts, and the creak of oars blends with the whisper of waves. On these very waters, ships brought not just silks and teas, but crates of opium pressed tight into chests, guarded by merchants whose eyes gleamed with profit. At first, opium came quietly, a pipe in a corner, a smoke in a hidden parlor. It was said to ease pain, to soften the edges of labor, to warm the mind in cold nights. But soon, the use spread. Scholars, once sharp of thought, became sluggish. Laborers neglected fields, soldiers dozed instead of drilling. The empire's strength, once woven from diligence and discipline, frayed gently at its seams. Picture a modest village by the Yangtze. The evening air is cool, cicadas hum softly, and the scent of lotus drifts across ponds. Within a clay house, a father lies reclined, pipe in hand, eyes half-lidded as smoke curls upward. His children watch with quiet unease. The rice fields outside grow untended, weeds overtaking the dikes. The tranquility of the scene is tinged with sorrow, for what should be thriving slips slowly into neglect. Meanwhile, in Canton, foreign merchants anchor their great ships, their sails billowing against the wind. Chests of opium are unloaded in secrecy, exchanged for silver, which flows outward like water draining from a basin. Inside dim tea houses, deals are struck over cups of jasmine tea. The scent of roasted leaves mingles with tobacco and resin, Coins clink softly, and with each exchange, the empire grows weaker, though many do not yet see it. In the Forbidden City, far to the north, the emperor hears whispers. Reports arrive of addiction in villages, of silver draining from treasuries, of corruption in officials meant to enforce the ban. Ministers bow deeply, their silk robes brushing the polished floor, and debate fiercely. Should we fight the trade? Punish the users? Negotiate with the foreigners? Their voices echo through the grand halls, lit by lanterns swaying in the draft. Outside, snow falls softly upon the vermilion walls, muffling the sound of turmoil within. And yet the opium flows on like a hidden current beneath a still surface. Unseen by many, unstoppable by few, it begins its slow work of unraveling. Our story now settles in the bustling port city of Canton, where the air hums with the sound of haggling voices. The shuffle of feet on cobblestones, and the distant calls of hawkers selling spices, fabrics, and porcelain. The Pearl River glitters under the sun, dotted with junks, sampans, and foreign ships with tall masts and sails. At the heart of this commerce lies a quiet secretopium moving through hidden hands, tucked in crates, disguised as goods. Inside an opium den, the world slows. The room is dim, lit only by oil lamps. The air is thick with fragrant smoke, heavy and sweet. Men recline on bamboo couches, eyes glazed, voices hushed to murmurs. Outside, the world bustles with trade and toil, but within these walls, time drifts like mist over a still pond. Imagine the silence, punctuated only by the faint hiss of a burning pipe and the gentle exhale of smoke. The British East India Company had discovered a dangerous balance. They bought Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain in vast amounts, yet China demanded silver in return. To correct this, they poured opium into China, a trade that shifted wealth away from the Middle Kingdom. Each pipe smoked was not only a man's moment of escape, but also another coin leaving imperial coffers. Silver, once steady in the treasuries of Beijing, trickled outward, draining the empire's strength. In the countryside, farmers once devoted to rice turned instead to the red blossoms of poppies. Their delicate petals glowed under the morning sun, swaying gently in the breeze. To the eye, the fields looked beautiful, rolling waves of crimson butt. They carried hidden sorrow. Where rice once fed families, opium now fed cravings. Hunger crept into villages. Children's laughter dimmed. The land itself seemed to sigh under the change. In the Forbidden City, the emperor grew restless. He walked through halls lined with golden dragons and carved jade, his silk robes sweeping over polished stones. The weight of the problem pressed upon him. Memorials arrived daily, written by officials alarmed at the devastation. Each scroll unrolled with neat brushstrokes, telling of ruined families, wasted soldiers, and empty granaries. The empire, so proud and ancient, was being hollowed out not by armies at the gates, but by smoke within its borders. It was here that the first sparks of resistance began to glow quiet, deliberate, and fueled by desperation. Our story now turns toward the man who would stand like a solitary flame. Against the spreading darkness, Lin Zexu, his name is spoken with reverence in the annals of history, for he embodied duty, resolve, and loyalty to the empire. Lin was a scholar official, steeped in the Confucian ideals of virtue and service. Picture him in his study. A tall window open to the night air, moonlight spilling across scrolls of bamboo and silk. A candle flickers gently, casting long shadows as his brush moves swiftly across parchment. He writes with precision, his thoughts sharp and his spirit unyielding. He has seen the devastation of opium with his own eyes. Families broken, soldiers weakened, coffers emptied on. He vows to root out the poison, no matter the cost. In Canton, Lin Zexu arrived with authority from the emperor. His presence was calm but commanding, his voice measured, his gaze unwavering. He issued edicts forbidding the trade, warning foreign merchants of dire consequences should they continue. Imagine the scene. A courtyard filled with officials in flowing robes, their voices echoing against carved stone walls. Lin stands at the center, reading aloud words that cut through the humid air like a bell. Heaven is watching. The empire cannot endure such destruction. His orders were not empty words. Opium dens were raided. Pipes were broken, their ashes scattered to the winds. Crates of the drug were seized from warehouses and brought to the coast. There, under Lin's command, they were destroyed. Thousands upon thousands of chests poured out into the sea. The dark resin seeped into the salt water, carried away by the tide. The waves themselves seemed to hiss, as if nature too rejected the poison. This act was bold, defiant, and deeply symbolic. It was a message to the world. China would not bow to addiction, nor to foreign profiteers. Yet across the seas, in the parlors of Britain, merchants and ministers bristled. They saw not morality but insult, not defense but defiance. The destruction of their opium was a spark that would ignite the fire of war. And so, while Lin Zexu stood resolute in Canton, beneath the soft winds and murmuring rivers of southern China, a storm gathered on the horizon ships, with iron cannons, sails stretched taut, and ambitions far larger than trade. The year was 1839, and the tides of history were shifting. As Lin Zexu enforced the emperor's will in Canton, foreign merchants and their ships lay restless beyond the harbor. Their cargo, their profits, their very pride had been cast into the sea. To them, the waves that carried away the opium were not only brine and salt water, but also silver lost. Fortunes dissolved and prestige challenged. Across the seas in Britain, the news spread like fire through the halls of Parliament and the drawing rooms of wealthy merchants. The destruction of opium so righteous in China's eyes was seen in London as an affront to British commerce and national honor. Voices rose demanding retribution. Our ships must sail, they said. Our rights must be defended. And so, plans began, not merely for negotiation, but for war. Picture the British ships, tall and stern, their masts creaking in the wind. Iron cannons lined their decks, polished and ready. Below, sailors coiled ropes and loaded powder, their boots striking the planks in steady rhythm. The sea air was sharp with salt, the cries of gulls overhead a contrast to the silence of men preparing for battle. These were not trading vessels, they were instruments of war, and their course was set for China's southern shores. Meanwhile, in Canton, life continued with deceptive calm. Merchants bustled in markets, their stalls filled with porcelain bowls, carved jade, silk garments shimmering under the light. The scent of roasted chestnuts and steamed dumplings wafted through the air. Yet beneath the daily rhythms, unease rippled quietly. Families whispered of foreign ships, a cannon fire that might one day echo across the Pearl River. Lin Zexu, steadfast, continued his work. He wrote to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to her sense of morality, asking why her nation permitted such trade that destroyed lives so far away. His words, carried by couriers and translated across seas, pleaded for compassion, for justice. But his letter would never find an answer that could halt what had already begun. The world was shifting, slowly, inevitably. The clash between principle and profit, morality and might, was no longer distant. It was drawing closer, like thunder rolling before a storm. The gardens of China still bloomed, the rivers still shimmered, but the shadows of war crept silently across the horizon. By the spring of 1840, the storm had arrived. Along the southern coast of China, the first sounds of cannon fire broke the stillness of the sea. The British fleet appeared upon the horizon, sails stretched wide, iron hulls gleaming in the sun. Villagers along the shore watched in silence, their eyes fixed on the foreign ships that seemed like floating fortresses. Some whispered prayers, others hurried inland, their footsteps scattering across narrow paths. The British were confident, for their weapons were unlike anything China had faced. Cannons roared with thunder, sending balls crashing into coastal defenses. The boom echoed across the water, shattering the peace of fishing villages and market towns. Chinese junks, wooden and light, were no match. Their sails tore, their hulls splintered, and their crews leapt desperately into the waves. Imagine standing at the edge of the Pearl River, the smoke rising into the sky. The scent of gunpowder lingers in the air, sharp and acrid. The cries of soldiers mix with the crash of waves and the crackle of flames consuming wooden ships. In moments, centuries of stability begin to feel fragile, as though even the rivers and winds trembled at the sound of war. Yet even as chaos spread, there was courage. Local militias gathered, farmers turned into fighters. With bamboo spears, bows, and old muskets, they faced ships bristling with iron. Their stand was brave, though their weapons seemed like whispers against thunder. Villagers carried water to put out flames. Families sheltered one another. and elders offered prayers at shrines, hoping the ancestors would shield the land. Far inland, in the halls of the Forbidden City, news traveled slowly but heavily. Scrolls arrive bearing grim tidings. The foreign ships bombard our coast. Our soldiers fight bravely, but their weapons are weak against theirs. The emperor sat among carved dragons and golden thrones, the silence of the court broken only by the rustle of robes and the trembling voices of ministers. Some counseled peace. Others demanded war without concession. The dynasty, once the center of the world, now faced a dilemma: cling to ancient ways and pride, or confront the modern force of foreign power. And so, the Opium War had truly begun, smoke rising, its echoes spreading, its consequences yet unseen, like a storm rolling deeper into the heart of the empire. The First Opium War spread along China's southern coast like fire moving through dry grass. City after city awoke to the sound of cannon fire, the smoke of burning ships, and the cries of soldiers unprepared for such force. For centuries, China had seen itself as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the civilized world. But now, before the thunder of foreign guns, that vision began to falter. In Canton, the streets once filled with merchants and markets now trembled with fear. Families shuttered their homes, lanterns dimmed early, and whispers filled the alleys. The British ships have come. The Pearl River, once alive with commerce, carried drifting wreckage, splintered wood, torn sails, and the faint scent of smoke. Imagine a small fishing village along the coast. Nets lie abandoned on the shore, boats pulled hastily onto sand. Women clutch their children close, while the men gather with whatever weapons they can: rusted swords, bamboo poles, even farming tools. They look toward the horizon, where sails loom like shadows against the setting sun. The sound of drums beats faintly in the distance, a signal of defense, though hope feels as fragile as paper in a storm. British soldiers, disciplined and drilled, landed upon the coast with steady steps. Their uniforms gleamed, their muskets ready. Against them, Chinese militia stood bravely but unevenly, their numbers great, yet their weapons outdated. The clash was sharp, brief, and devastating. Gunpowder filled the air, thick and choking. The ground shook with each cannon shot, and villages burned as warning fires spread, yet resistance was not absent. In certain strongholds, Chinese soldiers fought fiercely, their loyalty to the emperor unbroken. Drums pounded within city walls, arrows flew from battlements, and banners of red and gold waved defiantly in the wind. Even as fire consumed the gates, defenders held their ground until overwhelmed, their courage shining like sparks in the darkness. In Beijing, memorials poured into the court, their words heavy with grief and desperation. Officials wrote of villages destroyed, soldiers fallen, silver lost, and people terrified. The emperor listened in silence, his face calm but his spirit restless. He gazed out over the frozen gardens of the palace, snowflakes falling softly onto still ponds. The Middle Kingdom was vast, yet the storm had pierced its edges, and its heart began to feel the tremors. The war was no longer distant thunder, was a fire creeping ever closer, each battle another crack in the empire's grand walls. As the war pressed on, the imbalance between the two powers grew clearer with each clash. The British ships, iron and oak, moved with precision, their cannons capable of striking targets far inland. The Chinese forces, though courageous, were bound by traditions of warfare that seemed ancient against modern steel. Each encounter left villages smoldering, defenses shattered, and people displaced. Along the coastline, families fled into the hills. Mothers carried infants swaddled in cloth, elders leaned upon sticks, and children clung to their parents' robes. From high ground, they looked back toward their villages, watching smoke rise in heavy plumes that blurred the horizon. The once familiar sound of roosters and market bells was replaced by the distant thud of cannons and the crack of musket fire. In Canton, Lenzaxu remained resolute. By lamplight, he continued to write, his brushstrokes urgent yet graceful. His letters to the emperor detailed both the courage of local defenders and the devastation wrought by foreign arms. His words burned with loyalty, but also carried an undertone of sorrow. The empire was vast, yet unprepared for this new age. Picture him standing upon the city walls at dusk. The sky glows crimson, blending with the smoke that drifts above rooftops. Below, the Pearl River glimmers, carrying broken timbers and abandoned boats. Soldiers stand beside him, weary yet loyal, their armor dulled by battle, their faces lined with fatigue. Lin's gaze is steady, but in his heart he knows that bravery alone cannot repel an enemy armed with modern power. Far across the sea, in Britain, the war was spoken of differently. In the polished halls of London, officials raised glasses of wine as news of victory arrived. Maps were spread upon mahogany tables, lines drawn across coasts and rivers. To them it was not tragedy, but triumph, not suffering, but expansion. The clash of civilizations was seen as proof of progress, while the human cost was forgotten in the glow of pride. And yet for China, the war was more than a military conflict. It was a wound upon the spirit. Temples once filled with incense now echoed with prayers for protection. Farmers once bent over rice paddies now knelt in fields of ash. The empire, proud and enduring for centuries, began to feel the weight of vulnerability pressing like winter frost upon its roots. The First Opium War was not yet over, but its shadows had already reached deep into the heart of the Middle Kingdom. As the months of war stretched on, the British advanced further inland. Their ships patrolled rivers with ease, their sails catching the wind while their cannons loomed silently, a constant threat. Villages along the waterways lived in fear of those shadows that floated on the horizon, for with their arrival came fire, plunder, and sorrow. Picture the Yangtze River in late autumn. The water glides slowly, reflecting a pale sun. Bamboo groves line the banks, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. Yet this peace is broken by the echo of oars and the sight of black smoke rising from a distant town. Along the riverbanks, villagers hide among the reeds, clutching children close, watching helplessly as foreign vessels glide past with flags unfurled. In the city of Ningbo, resistance was fierce but brief. Walls that had stood for generations crumbled under bombardment. The cries of defenders rang out against the thunder of artillery. Still, even as gates splintered and fires spread, the people fought with stubborn pride, hurling stones, wielding spears, and clinging to the belief that loyalty to the emperor demanded sacrifice. The scent of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the smoke of burning homes. Meanwhile, the emperor's court in Beijing grew troubled. Ministers argued beneath painted ceilings and carved dragons. Some urged negotiation, fearing that the empire's strength could not withstand modern fleets. Others demanded continued resistance, unwilling to bow before foreign powers. The emperor sat in silence, torn between pride and survival, each memorial from the provinces a weight upon his spirit. Lin Zhaxu, still in Canton, continued his tireless work. But whispers grew against him. Some officials, fearing blame, accused him of provoking the foreign powers too harshly. Court politics began to erode his position, even as he labored to defend the empire. Imagine him in his chamber, candlelight flickering against scrolls piled high, his face calm but weary. He had stood bravely, yet now even his allies wavered. And so, the empire faced not only enemies from beyond the seas, but also divisions within its own halls. The roar of cannons was matched by the quieter, but no less dangerous, sound of doubt, suspicion, and shifting loyalties. The Middle Kingdom, vast and proud, found itself caught between the storms of foreign might and the erosion of unity within. Our story continues along the coast, where forts that once protected against pirates now trembled before thunderous broadsides. The British Navy moved with precision, their sailors hardened by years of conflict across distant seas. Their cannons roared, and even mighty walls that had stood against storms and raiders fell apart under iron fire. Picture the port of Amoy, with its narrow streets and tiled rooftops. Merchants had once crowded its markets, their stalls overflowing with porcelain, silk, and teas. But now, smoke rose in the distance, curling slowly into the gray sky. The echoes of bells rang out, not the cheerful call of trade, but alarms, hurried, desperate. Families rushed through alleyways, clutching bundles of cloth and small treasures, while soldiers scrambled to man crumbling battlements. And yet amid this destruction, there was still humanity. Imagine a mother drawing her children close, telling them softly that the storm will pass. Picture an elderly scholar sitting quietly in his courtyard, listening to the cannon fire, as if it were thunder rolling through the heavens knowing. The world he once cherished was slipping away, yet accepting it with quiet dignity. In London, far across the oceans, Parliament rejoiced at victories. Debates raged about the profits of trade, the morality of opium, and the pride of empire. Merchants counted coins with satisfaction, while clergymen thundered sermons about sin and salvation. But for those who profited, the human cost was distant, softened by the ocean's great divide. In Beijing, the emperor received grim reports. Provinces that once promised safety now cried out in despair. Governors pleaded for reinforcements, but resources were thin and morale thinner still. The Dragon Throne, so often seen as unshakable, now seemed like a lonely seat surrounded by waves of uncertainty. And always, at the center of this tragedy, opium flowed. Despite bans and confiscations, despite Lin Zexu's fiery efforts, the drug crept silently through the veins of the nation. In hidden rooms, pipes still burned. In the quiet hours of the night, men of every station surrendered themselves to its haze. The war outside was loud and brutal, but the war within against addiction was quieter. It's more insidious, and perhaps more devastating. The empire's greatness, long celebrated in poetry and song, was now tested as never before. The winds of change were not a gentle breeze, but a storm of iron, smoke, and shadow. As the war moved northward, the British drew closer to the great cities that lay at the empire's heart. Each step inland was like a drumbeat, echoing the message that China's isolation could no longer shield it. Along the Grand Canal, barges floated past once quiet villages, their sails patched but determined. These were not merchant boats carrying rice or silks, but warships, sleek and purposeful. The sight of them unsettled peasants who had known the canal as a lifeline of trade. Now its waters carried the instruments of destruction. The murmur of reeds in the wind was joined by the heavy splash of anchors. The commands shouted in unfamiliar tongues. In Hangzhou, famed for its beauty and its lake, poets who once wrote verses about lotus blossoms now found themselves writing laments. Picture the West Lake at dusk. Water shimmering under lantern light, reflections of willows rippling across its surface. But instead of lovers strolling along the bridges, there were soldiers tired, watchful, and uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. Meanwhile at court, frustration deepened. Memorials from the provinces piled high, each one a cry for resources and direction. The emperor, bound by ritual and tradition, found his power strangely fragile in this new era of steamships and rifles. He spoke of heaven's mandate, of the sacred duty to protect the people, but his words felt like echoes struggling to reach the present. Lin Zexu, recalled to Beijing, carried with him the weight of both failure and integrity. He had stood against opium. He had resisted with all the might available to him. And yet, the tide of events was larger than one man. History would remember him as both hero and scapegoat. Imagine him standing beneath the vermilion gates of the Forbidden City, his robes rustling softly in the autumn breeze, knowing he had done all that honor required, even if the empire did not reward him. For the common people, the war was less about politics and more about survival. Farmers hid their harvests, fearing looters from both sides. Children listened to the distant echoes of cannon fire, as if it were thunder from angry gods. In temples, incense burned day and night, prayers rising like smoke, fragile and uncertain. And all the while, the opium trade persisted, quiet as mist. Seeping into lives without sound, eroding strength without warning, the empire's enemy was not only external, it was already within. Our story now drifts to the fateful negotiations that would change China's destiny. After years of conflict, with forts fallen and rivers open to foreign ships, the empire was compelled to consider peace, though peace came with a heavy price. Picture a dimly lit chamber near the coast, the air thick with tension. On one side sat British officials, their uniforms crisp, their voices measured but firm. On the other side, Qing envoys in flowing robes, their expressions a mix of pride and grief. Between them lay documents, words inked onto parchment, carrying the weight of nations. The rustle of silk sleeves mingled with the scratch of quills as each side pressed their demands. The result was the Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842. It was a treaty not of friendship, but of surrender. Hong Kong Island was ceded to Britain, to stand as a fortress of trade and power. 5 ports were forced open: Canton, Amoy, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Shanghai, a gateway through which foreign merchants could flow freely, no longer bound by imperial control. Tariffs were fixed, customs weakened, and vast sums of silver were demanded as indemnities. For the British, these terms meant triumph. Their empire expanded, their coffers filled, their trade secured. But for China, it was the beginning of what would be remembered as the century of humiliation. The mandate of heaven, once thought unshakable, seemed suddenly fragile in the face of iron ships and foreign treaties. Imagine the emperor receiving the news in Beijing. The Forbidden City, usually a place of grandeur, must have felt cold and hollow that day. Courtiers bowed low, their faces downcast. No victory songs were sung, no banners were raised. Instead, silence filled the halls, broken only by the sigh of wind against carved wooden screens. In the ports, life changed swiftly. Foreign warehouses rose where once only Chinese merchants traded. Streets filled with new sounds, languages from far-off lands. Boots striking cobblestones, bells from ships docking at strange hours. Locals watched with wary eyes, knowing their world had shifted forever. And yet, amid the sorrow, the daily rhythm of life continued. Farmers still tilled fields. Children still played in alleyways. Incense still curled upward in temples. But beneath it all was a quiet awareness that the old order had cracked, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. The Treaty of Nanking was not the end, but only the beginning. For though the cannons had grown silent, the wounds remained open. Ports now forced open to foreign trade became centers of transformation, where old traditions brushed against new influences. In Shanghai, the changes were felt most sharply. Once a modest fishing town, it began to swell with activity. Foreign merchants constructed grand stone buildings along the Bund, their columns and facades unlike anything the Chinese had seen. Steamships docked in its harbor, bringing not only goods but ideas, fashions, and whispers of a wider world. Lanterns still glowed in the narrow alleys, but their light now mingled with foreign lamps that burned brighter and later into the night. For the people of these cities, life grew complicated. Some prospered, adapting quickly to the new order, trading silk, tea, and porcelain for Western machines and textiles. Others felt left behind, clinging to familiar rhythms, while resentment brewed quietly in their hearts. The presence of foreign soldiers and officials, walking the streets with confident strides, was a constant reminder of the empire's weakened hand. Meanwhile, in the countryside, little changed at first. Fields of rice and wheat still shimmered beneath the sun. Farmers bent low, their songs drifting across the wind, unchanged from generations before. Yet even there, the shadow of defeat crept in. Silver drained from the empire to pay indemnities, raising taxes, and deepening hardship. Families felt the squeeze, though they could not always name its cause. The emperor, too, felt the weight. To rule under the mandate of heaven was to embody strength and virtue. Here he was forced to sign treaties dictated by foreign powers. In the quiet of his palace, perhaps he wondered if heaven had turned its gaze elsewhere. The red walls of the Forbidden City remained tall, but they no longer inspired the same awe. In hidden chambers and secret gatherings, officials debated what had gone wrong. Some argued that China must adopt foreign weapons and technology to defend itself. Others insisted that clinging to tradition was the only way to preserve the empire's soul. Between these voices, hesitation grew and action faltered. The empire stood at a crossroads, torn between past glory and an uncertain future. As the new treaty ports opened, foreign enclaves began to take shape within China's great coastal cities. These settlements were carved out like islands, where Western laws and customs prevailed, separate from the land they occupied. To the local people, it was as if small foreign kingdoms had been planted in their midst. In Canton, narrow alleys, once filled with the scents of spices and teas, now echoed with foreign tongues. British, French, and American merchants walked boldly through streets lined with bamboo scaffolding and silk stalls. The hum of rickshaws mingled with the rattling of horse-drawn carriages, the two worlds colliding in sound as much as in sight. At the riverfront, Western ships loomed like giants, their sails and masts casting long shadows over traditional Chinese junks. For some, Opportunity blossomed in these new arrangements. Young translators, quick to learn foreign words, found work and status. Skilled craftsmen were hired to build Western-style houses with tiled roofs and wide windows. Chinese merchants who partnered with foreigners grew wealthy, their fortunes rising with the tide of change. Yet, for many others, resentment burned. Each new foreign building felt like a stone upon the chest of the empire, a reminder of what had been taken. Opium, too, flowed more freely than ever. Though outlawed still, its traffic grew under the protection of treaties and foreign power. In smoky dens, men of all classes reclined upon bamboo couches, their pipes sending up slow spirals of haze. The drug dulled hunger, quieted pain, and carried its users into dreams, but those dreams cost dearly, eroding the strength of families, draining coins from households already pressed by taxes. Meanwhile, within the Forbidden City, debates raged in the shadow of carved dragons. Reformers urged modernization, the forging of Western-style cannons, the construction of new fleets. Yet conservatives resisted, fearing that adopting foreign ways would unravel the very essence of Chinese civilization. The emperor listened, torn. While outside the Vermilion Walls, the empire shifted like sand beneath his feet. And so the empire lived in two times at once. One foot stood firmly in the traditions of the past, where ancestors were honored and rituals kept unchanged. The other slipped reluctantly into the current of a new world, pulled forward by forces that could not be ignored. It was a delicate balance, one that could not hold forever. The scars of the Opium War ran deep, not only in politics and trade, but also in the hearts of ordinary people. In villages far from the coast, rumors of the conflict traveled slowly, carried by merchants and wandering storytellers. By the time news reached the countryside, it was already tinged with fear, sorrow, and disbelief. Farmers working their paddies would pause, leaning on wooden tools, to hear of foreign ships that spat fire like dragons, of walls that fell in a single day, of treaties that forced the empire to bow. Some shook their heads in anger, others in confusion. How could the Middle Kingdom, long the center of the world, be humbled by outsiders? The questions lingered, unanswered, heavy as clouds before a storm. In the tea houses, elders told tales that mixed truth and myth. They spoke of battles fought bravely, of heroes who stood against impossible odds. In these stories, Lin Zhaxu became larger than life, a figure of loyalty and sacrifice. The listeners, sipping warm cups of tea, felt both pride and grief, pride in the courage shown, grief in the outcome that could not be changed. In cities, the changes were visible everywhere. Streets once reserved for traditional markets now carried goods from distant lands, cotton cloth from Manchester, clocks and watches from Switzerland, glassware that gleamed strangely in the sunlight. For the first time, some Chinese households owned mirrors unlike the polished bronze of their ancestors. These objects fascinated and unsettled, tokens of a world that felt both near and far. Yet amid all these changes, the presence of opium loomed like a shadow. Pipes were lit in hidden corners, their smoke curling through the night. The addiction spread silently, pulling fathers away from work, draining households of savings, leaving mothers and children to struggle. Officials sent out patrols, but corruption and fear often dulled their efforts. The more the empire resisted, the more opium seeped in, carried under the protection of foreign treaties. For the Qing court, every passing year after the Treaty of Nanking was a reminder that sovereignty was slipping away. And for the people, every pipe smoked, every silver tail drained, every foreign building razed, was a whisper that the world had changed, that the Middle Kingdom's old ways could no longer stand untouched. The empire endured, but the seeds of unrest had been planted. The years following the Treaty of Nanking brought no true peace. Instead, they revealed a fragile calm, like a pond whose surface seems still, though beneath it currents stir. Foreign merchants settled more firmly into the treaty ports, building warehouses, banks, and grand residences. Their flags fluttered boldly above the harbors, symbols of authority not easily ignored. In Shanghai, the transformation was most striking. Along the Bund, rows of stone buildings rose where once had been fishermen's huts. The Huangpu River, once busy with junks and sampans, now swelled with foreign steamships, their smoke trailing long across the sky. The city became a place where east and west coexisted uneasily, streets filled with Chinese rickshaws beside carriages drawn by foreign horses. For the local people, this mixture brought opportunity and tension alike. Skilled workers learned new crafts, printing presses, carpentry in foreign styles, even tailoring Western suits. Merchants who adapted grew rich, though often at the cost of resentment from neighbors who saw them as collaborators. The gap between those who benefited and those who suffered widened, leaving wounds deeper than battle scars. In the Forbidden City, however, Emperor and his advisors lived in a world seemingly untouched by foreign stone buildings and smoke-filled treaty ports. Rituals continued, grand ceremonies before ancestral tablets, processions through crimson gates, offerings made to heaven and earth. Yet beneath the surface, doubt gnawed at the court. Was the mandate of heaven still theirs, or had its favor shifted elsewhere? Opium remained a constant presence, a quiet conqueror. In dim rooms across the land, men reclined on bamboo couches, smoke curling from pipes, their eyes heavy with dreams. Families watched helplessly as silver coins, once saved for dowries or harvests, disappeared into the haze. The empire had survived war, but it could not so easily survive the poison within its veins. And as foreign influence grew stronger, so too did whispers of discontent among the people. Farmers burdened by taxes muttered against officials. Scholars wrote essays mourning the loss of dignity. Secret societies, hidden in mountain villages and crowded towns, began to speak of rebellion, not only against foreign powers, but against the Qing court itself. The war had ended, but its echoes lingered, ghosts that would grow louder, shaping the storms yet to come. The years after the Opium War unfolded like a long twilight, neither bright with victory nor wholly dark with defeat. Instead, the empire lived in a haze of unease, where every day seemed both familiar and uncertain. In the countryside, life went on with rhythms unchanged. Farmers sowed rice in flooded paddies, their reflections shimmering in the water. Children splashed in streams, chasing dragonflies beneath the summer sun, yet behind these daily joys lingered quiet worries. Taxes weighed heavier than before, and rumors spread of silver leaving the empire in endless streams, flowing outward like rivers that never returned. In the treaty ports, the transformation was undeniable. Shanghai, Ningbo, Cantonese became stages where foreign and Chinese lives intertwined, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. Missionaries opened schools and hospitals, their chapels rising with crosses unfamiliar to the local skyline. Some families welcomed the learning and medicines offered, curious about these new teachings. Others recoiled, fearing the erosion of their traditions. The streets reflected this contrast. One alley might echo with the chanting of monks, incense curling into the air, while another resounded with the chiming of church bells, sharp and foreign. The city became a place of overlapping worlds, where the old and the new collided with each passing day. At the imperial court, the weight of humiliation was heavy. Officials debated endlessly, some humbled by the empire's defeat. Argued that China must study the foreigners' way ships, guns, and machines that had brought such power. Others resisted fiercely, believing that to imitate the West was to abandon the soul of the Middle Kingdom. The emperor listened, torn between pride and necessity, the burden of tradition pressing heavily upon his every choice. And through it all, opium flowed. The drug that had sparked the war did not vanish with the treaties that spread more deeply. In the dim glow of oil lamps, men lay in silence, their pipes glowing faintly like embers. Entire households suffered as fathers, sons, and brothers wasted away in smoky stupor. For some, it was an escape from hardship. Well, for others, it was a chain, pulling them further from life's duties. The empire endured, but it was no longer whole. Its heart beat on, steady yet weakened, while shadows gathered at its edges. The war had ended, but the struggle for China's soul had only begun. The Treaty of Nanking had reshaped China, but it was not the last word. Our treaties would follow, each one prying open the empire's gates a little wider. Yet, in the years immediately after, people tried to rebuild their lives in the shadows of change. In Guangzhou, once the jewel of southern trade, foreign warehouses lined the Pearl River. Their brick walls and tall chimneys stood in stark contrast to the curved roofs of nearby temples. The river that had carried junks laden with tea and porcelain now hosted foreign vessels, unloading crates marked with strange letters. The water reflected two worlds enchanted in new drifting uneasily side by side. For local merchants, this new era brought mixed fortunes. Some embraced the opportunities, trading directly with foreigners and earning profits that once would have been unimaginable. They built larger houses decorated with both Chinese screens and Western furniture, blending styles in ways that reflected their changing world. Others, however, fell into ruin, unable to compete, watching helplessly as foreign goods undercut their wares. And always the specter of opium loomed. Though the emperor had banned it, though Lin Zexu had burned it in defiance, it flowed more freely than ever. Soldiers, scholars, even some officials in high positions succumbed to its grip. Imagine a quiet courtyard, moonlight spilling over stone tiles, where a once dutiful son lies motionless, pipe in hand, his spirit dulled by the smoke. His family watches in silence, bound by both love and despair. In the north, the Forbidden City remained outwardly majestic. Vermilion walls and golden roofs gleamed beneath the sun. Ceremonies continued, drums and gongs sounding in rhythmic splendor. Yet beneath the ritual there was unease. The emperor and his court carried the knowledge that their authority had been challenged, that their once unshakable position in the world had been altered. For the people, these changes were both distant and immediate. A farmer in Henan still tilled his soil, scarcely thinking of treaties, but he noticed the taxes that grew heavier. A scholar in Suzhou still painted lotus blossoms, yet his poems carried tones of sorrow unknown in earlier days. The Middle Kingdom had not fallen, but its armor was cracked, its spirit tested, and in those cracks, new storms gathered, waiting for their time. By the mid-19th century, the wounds of the Opium War had begun to seep into every corner of Chinese life. The empire still stood proud, with its great walls, its vast rivers, and its ancient traditions, yet something invisible had shifted. It was as though a grand painting, once flawless, now bore faint cracks upon its surface. In the bustling port of Shanghai, life grew stranger with each passing year. Along the Bund, foreign banks and trading houses rose taller, their stone facades casting shadows over narrow Chinese streets filled with lantern light. By day, sailors from far-off lands unloaded cargo, their shouts echoing across the harbor. By night, the air filled with the mingled scents of incense and tobacco. Dumplings steaming in bamboo baskets while foreign lamps burned with an unfamiliar glow. The city had become a place where cultures met uneasily, each one wary, each one curious. Some Chinese youths found themselves drawn to the foreign world. They learned English words, studied Western books, and dressed in new fashions. A few traveled abroad, returning with tales of machines that roared like dragons and cities lit brighter than stars. For others, however, these changes felt like betrayal, a departure from the wisdom of ancestors. Tension grew, not only between China and the foreigners, but among the Chinese themselves. The presence of opium made these divides sharper. In smoky dens, men wasted away, their families left in sorrow. The drug that had begun as a trade item now hollowed out households, turning strength into frailty, diligence into despair. Officials sent inspectors, but too often those inspectors were themselves corrupted, their purses filled with silver to look the other way. And yet amid all this, traditions persisted. Temples, incense still rose in curling trails. Prayers still carried upward. Families still gathered for festivals, red lanterns swaying in the breeze, drums and firecrackers chasing away the dark. These rituals anchored the people, even as the world around them shifted. But history does not stand still. Beyond the treaty ports, beyond the villages, larger forces brewed. Discontent stirred among peasants who felt forgotten, among scholars who mourned the empire's humiliation, and among secret societies who whispered of rebellion. The First War was over, but it had set in motion waves that would crash harder still. As the empire tried to steady itself after defeat, a quiet unease settled across the land. The Opium War had ended, but the memory of it lingered like a shadow over every hall, every harbor, every village. In the Forbidden City, the emperor sat upon the dragon throne, the weight of tradition upon his shoulders. Courtiers bowed low, their silk robes whispering across marble floors. Yet beneath the glitter of ceremony lay doubt. Reports arrived daily from governors in the provinces, silver leaving in endless streams. People falling into ruin, discontent spreading like wildfire. The rituals of power continued, but the confidence that once defined the dynasty had grown fragile. In the countryside, farmers felt the burden most. Taxes demanded to pay foreign indemnities fell upon their shoulders. Silver was scarce, crops often meager. Families sold heirlooms, oxen, even land, struggling to survive. At night, around small fires, they whispered about the empire's weakness, about rulers who seemed distant from their suffering. For generations, the mandate of heaven had been believed to rest upon the emperor. But now, many wondered if heaven still favored the Qing. The ports, however, told a different story. Foreign goods flooded in, cloth that was cheaper than local weavers could produce, medicines in glass bottles, clocks that ticked with steady rhythms. For some, these goods were marvels. For others, they were reminders that China's greatness was being challenged. Alongside these goods came opium, still slipping quietly through the cracks of law. Carried in crates marked falsely, spread under the protection of treaties. In smoky dens, pipes glowed faintly, men reclining in dreamlike stupor. Families grew poorer, work went undone, and hope dimmed. The drug was not just a trade, it had become a quiet conqueror, weakening the empire from within, even as foreign ships pressed at its coasts. Yet, amid the sorrow, resilience remained. Scholars still painted calligraphy with patient strokes. Villagers still gathered for festivals, their lanterns glowing like stars against the dark. Children laughed as they chased fireflies through fields. These small acts of life carried the essence of endurance, even as storms gathered on the horizon. The first clash with foreign powers had ended, but it had left China standing at a crossroads, uncertain of which path to take, yet unable to turn back. The signing of the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was more than an end to war, it was the beginning of a new order. One that unsettled the balance the Qing Dynasty had long relied upon. It was the first of what came to be called the unequal treaties, agreements that stripped China of both pride and protection. Hong Kong, once a quiet fishing harbor, passed into British hands. To the Qing court, it was a humiliating loss, though they could not have foreseen how important that island would one day become. More ports were pried open: Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, becoming gateways through which not only goods but ideas, influences, and ambitions flowed. Foreigners established enclaves, where Chinese law had no power. The empire, once self-contained and sovereign, now found itself divided by invisible lines of foreign privilege. Merchants in Shanghai felt the change most acutely. The city, once provincial, became a bustling crossroads of east and west. Sailors' shouts echoed in many tongues, and warehouses brimmed with goods. Wealth could be found here, fortunes made in trade, but the cost was sovereignty. To the older generation, it felt as though the walls of the old world were crumbling. To the younger, opportunities gleamed, but so too did dangers. For the common people, life carried on in rhythms of planting and harvesting, of marriages and mourning. Yet even in the remotest villages, news of humiliation trickled through. The prestige of the dynasty weakened. Officials who once commanded respect were now seen with suspicion. How could they defend the land if they could not defend against foreign intrusion? In quiet rooms, scholars debated what had gone wrong. Some believed the empire needed to strengthen itself, to learn from foreign technologies, while holding fast to Confucian values. Others argued that opening the door wider would only weaken the traditions that had kept the empire strong. The questions remained unresolved, like an echo that lingered in the corridors of history. And always, at the edges of these debates, opium lingered. Smuggled still, consumed still, its smoke rose into the night air. Even as the court sought reform, this hidden enemy hollowed the strength of the people. The empire had survived the first blow, but the seeds of future struggles had already been sown. The years following the First Opium War were marked by a fragile calm, though beneath that stillness, unrest brewed. Foreign merchants prospered, their fortunes built on tea, silk, and the quiet persistence of opium trade. The Qing officials, bound by the treaties, found themselves unable to control the tides that swept into their ports. Each year, more silver flowed outward, and with it, the very lifeblood of the empire's economy. In the countryside, whispers grew louder. Farmers complained of rising taxes, levied to pay the indemnities promised to foreign powers. Banditry increased, as desperate men took to the hills. Villagers often looked to local gentry for guidance rather than distant imperial officials, whose presence seemed ever more faint. The great Qing administration, once famed for its reach and order, seemed increasingly hollow. Amid these tensions, secret societies began to stir. In hidden rooms lit by flickering lamps, men and women gathered to speak of justice, of change, of rebellion. The memory of humiliation at foreign hands mixed with resentment toward corrupt officials. For many, it felt as if the mandate of heaven was slipping from the Qing rulers, as though the dynasty's sacred connection to divine order had begun to fray. The opium dens told a darker tale still. Within their smoke-filled chambers, men reclined with pipes in hand, their minds adrift, their ambitions drained. Husbands neglected families, sons failed in their studies, workers abandoned their tasks. Entire households crumbled under the weight of addiction. The drug had woven itself into the daily life of the empire, quietly undoing its strength from within. And yet, life continued in strange contrasts. Lantern festivals still lit the night skies with glowing colors. Temples still filled with the sound of chanting monks. Brides still walked under red silk veils, and children still flew kites in spring winds. The resilience of ordinary people shone, even as storms gathered unseen. But beyond the walls of villages and cities, foreign powers watched with keen eyes. For them, the first victory was only the beginning. Each crack in the empire's armor, each division among its people, was an opening through which they might press further. The dragon of China still stood, but its scales were scarred, and its fire dimmed. As the 1840s gave way to the 1850s, the Qing Dynasty found itself balancing on a fragile thread. Externally, the foreign presence expanded, their ships larger, their demands sharper. Internally, the empire was fracturing, not only from the flow of opium, but from deeper discontent rooted in poverty and corruption. Among the most pressing signs of instability was the rise of the Taiping movement. In the hills of Guangxi, a man named Hong Xiuquan preached visions of a new kingdom, one free of corruption, free of opium, and free of the weakness that seemed to plague the Qing. His words resonated with peasants who had long suffered under the weight of taxation and famine. Many who had lost fathers, brothers, or livelihoods to addiction saw in his message a promise of renewal. The Qing court, however, could not yet grasp the scale of the storm forming in the south. To them, foreign treaties were the urgent crisis, opium a spreading poison. But rebellion had long been suppressed with imperial authority. Yet the seeds of Taiping grew stronger each season, watered by disillusion and hardship. Meanwhile, in the port cities, contrasts became ever more stark. Along the Bund in Shanghai, foreign merchants built houses in Western styles, their windows wide, their furnishings rich with imported goods. Just beyond these enclaves, Chinese workers carried crates, repaired ships, and endured low wages. The divide between foreign privilege and local struggle deepened bitterness. Opium's grip remained relentless. Despite bans, despite proclamations, the trade thrived. The profits were immense, not only for the foreign merchants, but also for those within China who aided the trade. Corruption spread through officials who looked away, who accepted bribes to allow shipments through. For every chest burned publicly, a dozen more slipped silently into the markets. And in the quiet of night, families wept over sons who had fallen into the haze of the drug. Scholars abandoned their studies, workers left their tools, soldiers weakened in body and spirit. The empire's foundations were not simply threatened, they were quietly being hollowed. Still, amid this sorrow, traditions endured. Families lit incense before ancestors. Farmers followed the cycle of the seasons. Monks in remote temples rang their bells at dawn and dusk, steady notes reminding all who heard them that life carried on, even in troubled times. The Qing court, though shaken by the foreign intrusion, still clung to rituals of grandeur. In the Forbidden City, ministers lined the great halls, their voices rising in formal petitions, their robes flowing in silken folds. Yet the emperor, burdened by endless reports of decline, often felt the weight of centuries pressing against his shoulders. For generations, the dragon throne had symbolized unshakable power. Now, whispers of weakness crept even into the palace itself. News from the provinces was grim. Floods in some regions, droughts in others. Locust swarms devoured harvests. Families starved, and in their suffering, They turned their anger toward the dynasty. Officials, often corrupt and overwhelmed, did little to ease the burden. Many peasants sold their last possessions to pay taxes, only to see those coins vanish into the pockets of local magistrates. Amid such hardship, opium's presence deepened despair. In villages, men once known for their strength now lay in smoky chambers, their eyes glazed, their futures stolen. Wives and children struggled to survive, their breadwinners lost to the haze. The empire's strength did not fall with a single blow. It dissolved slowly like paper left in water. Meanwhile, in the bustling ports, foreign merchants saw opportunity. Warehouses filled with goods, ships came and went with steady rhythm. British, French, and later American traders extended their reach, not only selling but shaping markets, dictating terms. Chinese merchants who cooperated sometimes prospered, but always under the shadow of foreign dominance. In Shanghai, new streets bustled with rickshaws, porters, and carriages. Western-style buildings rose beside traditional wooden shops. The sound of church bells joined the gongs of temples. Cultures intertwined, yet rarely as equals. Too many locals, it felt less like exchange and more like intrusion. The dynasty sought to reassert control through decrees, through proclamations against opium, against corruption, against rebellion. But words written on silk scrolls could not heal the empire's wounds. The deeper problems, poverty, disillusion, and foreign exploitation, continued to spread like cracks in a vast wall. Still, in the stillness of the countryside, beauty lingered. Plum blossoms bloomed in winter, rivers shimmered under the moonlight, poets found solace in quiet verses. The resilience of culture, its art, its philosophy, its rituals remained a thread that tied the people together, even as storms gathered beyond the horizon. As the 1850s unfolded, the Qing Dynasty stood at a perilous crossroads. The wounds of the First Opium War had not healed, and yet new challenges pressed against the empire from within. The Taiping Rebellion, born from the visions of Hong Xiuquan, was no longer a whisper in the hills. It had become a roar. Villagers, peasants, and disillusioned scholars flocked to the movement. Their banners proclaimed a heavenly kingdom, promising equality, shared wealth, and a world free from the poison of opium. To those broken by famine, taxation, and addiction, such promises were irresistible. Families abandoned their homes, carrying little more than hope to join this tide of change. The Qing armies, stretched thin, struggled to contain the rebellion. Many soldiers themselves bore the marks of the opium scourge, their discipline weakened, their bodies frail. Commanders wrote desperate pleas for reinforcements, their words filled with both fear and resignation. The rebellion spread like wildfire, capturing city after city, shaking the empire to its foundations. At the same time, in treaty ports like Shanghai and Canton, foreign merchants watched with cautious eyes. For them, stability meant continued trade. Some supplied the Qing with arms, others offered the same to rebels. Profit flowed wherever chaos surged. To outsiders, China's troubles were opportunity. In villages untouched by rebellion, life remained simple but strained. Farmers bent over their fields, coaxing rice from muddy soil, their backs aching, their stomachs often empty. Yet even in hardship, they clung to rituals of honor-burning incense at family altars, teaching children the classics, weaving together the threads of tradition that had endured for centuries. Still, opium's shadow persisted. Pipes glowed in secret chambers, smoke curling into rafters. It was whispered that even some officials who spoke loudly against the drug privately indulged in its haze. Hypocrisy and weakness fed the people's anger. The dynasty fought battles on two fronts, against foreign powers demanding concessions, and against its own people rising in defiance. Each clash left the dragon more weary, its fire dimmer. Yet the empire still stood, though trembling, as if daring fate to test its strength once more. And fate would, in time, press harder still. The Taiping Rebellion spread with astonishing speed. By the mid-1850s, it controlled vast stretches of southern China, establishing its capital in Nanjing. The city, once a jewel of dynasties past, was transformed into the heavenly capital. For the Qing court in Beijing, this was more than a rebellion, it was a rival kingdom, a challenge to their very legitimacy. The Qing armies, already weakened by corruption and opium, faced humiliating defeats. Reports of entire garrisons surrendering or fleeing reached the imperial palace. Panic grew, though the rituals of state continued, as if ceremony could mask the cracks spreading through the empire. In Nanjing, the Taiping leaders instituted strict new codes. Opium was forbidden outright. Gambling, foot-binding, and other practices were banned. Men and women were to be treated more equally, families reorganized under new laws. Too many peasants weary of Qing rule, these changes felt like a promise of renewal. Yet the harshness of Taiping discipline, coupled with growing internal rivalries, made their vision difficult to sustain. Foreign powers observed carefully. Though they disdained Qing weakness, they did not wholly trust the Taiping either. Trade was their priority, and trade depended on stability. Merchants in Shanghai found themselves caught between two great forces, the imperial army struggling to reclaim control, and the rebels pushing ever closer. The streets filled with fear, yet also with opportunity as profiteers supplied weapons and provisions to both sides. Through it all, opium remained. Though banned in Taiping lands and Qing territories, it spread unchecked. The irony was sharp. While armies clashed for control of cities, the quiet battle of addiction hollowed the empire from within. Soldiers smoked to numb their fear, scholars smoked to escape their despair, laborers smoked to ease their exhaustion. Each pipe weakened not only the man who held it, but also the empire that depended upon his strength. And yet amid the chaos, resilience still shone. Mothers sang lullabies to their children, farmers repaired dikes to save their crops, scholars copied classical texts by candlelight. The enduring pulse of daily life carried on, even as dynasties and rebellions fought above it. The struggle between Qing and Taiping would rage for years, consuming millions of lives, leaving scars upon the land as deep as any foreign war. The mid-19th century in China was a time of fire and shadow. The Taiping rebellion raged. The countryside groaned under famine and taxation. And still the smoke of opium curled silently in homes and barracks alike. It was as though two storms struck the empire at once, one violent and visible, the other quiet but no less destructive. For the Qing court, survival became a daily calculation. The dynasty called upon regional leaders, powerful governors, and generals to muster their own armies. Among them rose figures like Zheng Gofan, whose disciplined forces would, over time, turn the tide against the Taiping. But this reliance on provincial power planted seeds of decentralization. The empire, once firmly commanded from Beijing, now leaned on men whose loyalty was as much to their provinces as to the throne. In the villages, the war brought devastation. Fields lay fallow, trampled by soldiers or abandoned by farmers forced to flee. Rivers ran red in places where battles were fought. Hunger stalked the land, and with hunger came disease. Families fractured, children orphaned, elders left behind. The promise of peace, whether under Qing or Taiping, seemed a distant dream, yet in the treaty ports, life took on a different rhythm. Shanghai grew into a bustling hub, its streets lined with Western shops, its harbor crowded with ships from far-off lands. To the local Chinese, this mingling of cultures was bewildering. Foreign missionaries built schools, teaching languages and sciences unfamiliar to many. Some embraced these changes, believing they might strengthen China. Others resisted, fearing that with each foreign lesson, a piece of tradition slipped away. Opium remained the thread running through all of this. Foreign merchants continued their trade, the profits irresistible. Despite official bans and punishments, the demand endured. In cities, dens filled nightly. In villages, secret pouches of the drug circulated among weary farmers. Even soldiers at the front were not immune. Their strength dulled when the empire needed it most. Through all of this, one truth became clear. China was being tested not by a single challenge, but by many woven together. Rebellion, foreign intrusion, addiction, corruption. Each was a weight upon the dragon, dragging it lower. And yet, within its people, a quiet endurance remained, as steady as the flow of the great rivers. By the late 1850s, as the Taiping rebellion stretched on, another storm gathered on the horizon: the Second Opium War. The foreign powers, dissatisfied with the terms of the Treaty of Nanking, pressed for more. Wider trade, greater privileges, deeper concessions. To them, the empire's weakness was an opportunity too great to ignore. British and French forces joined in demanding new treaties. When the Qing court resisted, conflict erupted once again. The clash was swift and devastating. Foreign ships, armed with modern weapons, advanced along China's coastlines and rivers, their cannons thundering against ancient walls. Cities fell, defenses crumbled, and once more the empire was forced to bow. This new humiliation brought even harsher terms. More ports opened, foreigners gained even greater rights, and opium once declared illegal was now formally legalized in trade. What had once been smuggled in shadows now flowed openly, sanctioned by treaty. For the Qing, it was a bitter surrender. For the people, a deep wound. In Beijing, the conflict reached its most painful moment, when foreign troops marched upon the capital itself. The burning of the Summer Palace in 1860 left scars not only on the land but on the spirit of the empire. Once a place of beauty, filled with gardens, lakes, and halls of art, it was reduced to smoldering ruins. To the Chinese, this act was not only an attack on property, but an insult to culture, to pride, to the very heart of their civilization. Meanwhile, the common people bore the consequences. Farmers faced higher taxes to pay for indemnities. Soldiers, poorly equipped and poorly led, often turned their frustration upon those they were meant to protect. Families watched helplessly as their sons were conscripted or their homes destroyed in battles they did not choose. Opium's grip tightened further. With legalization, its availability spread wider than ever before. Dens flourished in cities and in villages. Even the poorest could sometimes find a pipe to borrow. The dreamlike haze it offered felt like escape, though in truth it deepened despair. Thus, while foreign powers celebrated their victories, within China, the sense of decline grew sharper. The dynasty remained, but each treaty, each concession, chipped away at its authority, leaving it more a shadow than a sovereign power. The aftermath of the Second Opium War left the Qing Dynasty more fragile than ever. Though the emperor still sat upon the dragon throne, the dynasty's dignity was cracked, its sovereignty diminished. The legalization of opium, forced upon China by foreign powers, felt too many like a cruel betrayal of the people. The empire that had once been the center of the world now seemed at the mercy of outsiders. Foreign settlements expanded in port cities. Streets once filled with traditional wooden shops now echoed with the sound of foreign carriages, the ringing of church bells, and the chatter of merchants speaking in English, French, and other tongues. Signs in multiple languages appeared along Shanghai's Bund. Where grand buildings rose, their stone facades unlike anything the Chinese had seen before. These enclaves operated under foreign laws, immune to Chinese authority, standing as daily reminders of the dynasty's weakness. For the scholar class, this humiliation was almost unbearable. Raised to believe in the greatness of the Middle Kingdom, they now witnessed their traditions eclipsed. Some clung more fiercely to Confucian order, hoping that stricter adherence might restore balance. Others began to look outward, studying foreign sciences, weapons, and philosophies, seeking answers to the question that burned in every heart. Why had the empire fallen behind? In the countryside, life grew harsher still. Famine returned in cycles, intensified by floods and poor harvests. Families broke apart under the strain of taxes levied to pay indemnities. In some villages, the addiction to opium became so widespread that fields were left untended, entire communities slipping into quiet ruin. The elders whispered that the spirit of the people was being drained, as though the empire's very breath had grown shallow. And yet alongside despair, a spark of resilience glimmered. In temples, monks copied scriptures, preserving wisdom for future generations. In hidden courtyards, teachers instructed young pupils, passing down poetry and history. Merchants, though burdened, found ways to adapt, weaving Chinese goods into the new web of global trade. The empire was wounded, but not lifeless. It continued, fragile yet enduring, like a tree scarred by lightning, but still rooted deep. Still the question lingered, unspoken but heavy. How long could the dragon endure under such strain? The burning of the Summer Palace and the treaties that followed marked more than military defeat. They marked a deep wound in China's collective memory. For the people, these were not just political losses, but spiritual ones. Signs that the mandate of heaven, the sacred trust between the rulers and the ruled, might have slipped away from the Qing. In Beijing, officials debated endlessly. Some urged reform, calling for modernization of the military, adoption of foreign technologies, and new approaches to governance. Others resisted, fearing that foreign influence would erode the moral order upon which society rested. The court became a place of hesitation, torn between tradition and change, while outside its walls, the empire continued to unravel. The legalization of opium deepened the crisis. Once condemned, the drug now poured into cities openly, carried in crates stacked high in warehouses. Dens multiplied, their doors opening, even in neighborhoods once proud of their sobriety. Soldiers smoked before battles, merchants smoked after dealings, scholars smoked to ease their shame. The haze of the drug became part of daily life, an invisible shroud draped across the empire. In the provinces, rebellion still smoldered. The Taiping continued their fight, while other uprisings broke out, fueled by famine, corruption, and despair. Secret societies flourished, their members swearing oaths beneath candlelight, dreaming of overthrowing the dynasty. To many, the Qing no longer seemed a guardian of the people, but a stumbling relic, unable to defend or provide. Yet amid ruin, resilience endured. Farmers still followed the rhythms of the earth, planting and harvesting with hope that next year would be kinder. Poets still wrote verses of longing and beauty, their words carrying solace across generations. Families, though fractured, gathered to honor ancestors, lighting incense that glowed softly in the dark. These rituals, unchanged for centuries, reminded the people of their roots, their endurance, their strength. For the foreign powers, China's struggles were opportunity. They expanded their settlements, secured more privileges, and dreamed of further influence. To them, the empire seemed ripe for carving, a vast land weakened from within. The dragon still breathed, but faintly, its once mighty roar reduced to a weary whisper, awaiting the trials yet to come. The years after the Second Opium War brought little peace to China. Instead, they revealed just how fragile the empire had become. Foreign embassies now stood in Beijing, symbols of influence that once would have been unthinkable. Their presence was a daily reminder that sovereignty had been compromised. In the treaty ports, foreign merchants thrived. Their shops overflowed with imported cloth, clocks, and medicines. Their banks handled trade with efficiency, drawing Chinese silver into foreign coffers. Streets bustled with a new rhythm. Missionaries preaching, sailors shouting, rickshaw drivers weaving between carts. To the people, this mingling of cultures was both fascinating and unsettling. The old order felt as though it were dissolving beneath their feet. For scholars and reform-minded officials, these changes sparked urgent debate. Some argued that the empire must learn from the West, top their weapons, their industries, their schools. They spoke of self-strengthening, a movement that sought to marry Chinese tradition with foreign knowledge. But others feared that every borrowed idea chipped away at the heart of Chinese identity. This struggle between adaptation and preservation would shape the decades to come. In the countryside, life remained precarious. Heavy taxes continued, imposed to cover the costs of war and indemnities. Floods and droughts devastated harvests. Families sold land and livestock to survive. For many, despair pushed them toward rebellion or into the haze of opium. In some villages, entire households vanished into addiction, their fields untended, their children left wandering. Opium dens became almost unavoidable in larger towns. Within the glow of pipes cast flickering light across hollowed faces, men reclined in dreamlike stupor, their ambitions dissolving into smoke. Though some officials still tried to enforce bans, the legalized trade made enforcement almost meaningless. The drug's grip on the people tightened, its poison spreading deeper into the empire's veins, and yet resilience persisted. In quiet gardens, elders taught grandchildren the stories of Confucius. In marketplaces, vendors laughed and bartered, their voices rising above the din. During festivals, lanterns floated into the night sky, glowing like stars, a reminder that beauty still existed amid hardship. The dynasty stood, but it was fragile like porcelain. Splendid yet cracked, vulnerable to the pressures of both foreign power and domestic unrest. By the 1870s, the Qing Dynasty was caught in a paradox. Outwardly, it seemed to regain a measure of stability. Rebellions were suppressed, the throne stood intact, and foreign nations, for the time being, refrained from further wars. Yet beneath this veneer, the foundations of the empire continued to erode. The self-strengthening movement began to take root. Reformist officials, deeply shaken by the humiliations of the Opium Wars, urged the adoption of Western technology. Shipyards were built, arsenals established, and schools opened where mathematics, foreign languages, and engineering were taught. Steamships appeared along the rivers, ironclads patrolled the coast, and modern rifles replaced ancient spears in some regiments. But progress was uneven. Corruption often siphoned funds from projects. Local governors, jealous of their power, resisted central reforms. Many scholars clung fiercely to tradition, believing that to embrace foreign ways was to betray the soul of the empire. Thus, half measures became the hallmark of this era. Enough change to create friction, but not enough to restore strength. Meanwhile, the opium trade endured, though its character shifted. While foreign merchants had once dominated by this period, Chinese growers and sellers also profited. Poppy fields stretched across provinces, their scarlet blossoms beautiful yet destructive. The substance that had first entered through foreign ships now rooted itself in domestic soil. In towns and villages, opium's dual nature was visible. For some, it was a medicine to soothe pain, offered by family healers in tiny doses. For others, it was an escape from hunger, grief, and unyielding toil, yet the cost was devastating. Households sold possessions, pawned heirlooms, even gave away ancestral landall to sustain the craving. The wealth of generations melted away in smoke. Foreign observers often wrote of this contradiction, a land of immense richness, ancient wisdom, and vibrant culture, yet weakened by a powder that dulled its spirit. They described bustling markets filled with silks and ceramics, temples alive with incense, and scholars debating under shaded courtyards yet always. Nearby, the faint sweet smell of opium drifting from shuttered rooms. At court, the emperor and his advisors wrestled with impossible questions. Could the dynasty survive by blending old and new? Could it maintain harmony while the people suffered under the weight of addiction and taxation? These uncertainties loomed like gathering clouds, heavy and inevitable. As the 19th century edged closer to its final decades, the Qing court found itself under the shadow of new challenges. Western powers continued to expand their influence, carving spheres of control across the empire. The treaties signed after the Opium Wars had given them more than trade. They had gained footholds in China's very soil. Shanghai, once a modest town, had grown into a bustling cosmopolitan hub. Its waterfront, known as the Bund, shimmered with foreign-built banks, warehouses, and consulates. Steamers crowded its harbors, carrying goods in and out with relentless rhythm. Within its international settlement, street lamps glowed at night, a marvel of modernity unknown in much of the empire. Chinese merchants and foreign traders rubbed shoulders there, bound together by profit, yet divided by culture. To the Qing rulers, Shanghai was both a jewel and a wound. It brought wealth, but it also showcased the dynasty's lack of control. Extraterritorial laws allowed foreigners to live under their own rules, immune from Chinese courts. Here, the emperor's writ held no sway, and within Shanghai's shadows, opium still reigned. Dens sprawled across alleys, hidden behind wooden doors, their interiors filled with the languid haze of smoke. Foreign traders had once carried the drug across oceans, but now Chinese merchants distributed it widely. The habit had spread too deeply to be untangled easily. Even officials tasked with suppressing opium were sometimes themselves ensnared in its embrace. The empire's contradictions grew sharper. In one part of the city, Chinese students studied English, learning Western sciences and translating books on steam engines. In another, men reclined in stupor, their ambition dissolved in smoke. Both realities existed side by side, pulling the empire in opposing directions. Meanwhile, in the Forbidden City, the elderly Empress Dowager Cixi rose in influence. She maneuvered with cunning, balancing factions, ensuring her control over the court. Though often criticized by reformists, she embodied the tension of the age seeking to preserve tradition, yet reluctantly permitting selective reforms when survival demanded it. Beyond the palaces and ports, the countryside still bore the greatest burden. Farmers taxed heavily, watched much of their grain disappear into the coffers of officials. Famines flared when floods or droughts struck, and too often, relief was inadequate. To many, the dynasty no longer seemed the benevolent guardian of the people, but a distant power clinging to survival. The late 1800s brought storms from beyond China's borders, storms that would test the already fragile dynasty. One of the greatest shocks came from the east, from Japan. Once viewed as a smaller, less advanced neighbor, Japan had transformed rapidly after its own encounter with the West. The Meiji Restoration propelled it into modernity, building railways, factories, and a disciplined military that rivaled Europe's. When conflict arose over Korea, a land both China and Japan claimed influence over, war erupted in 1894. The First Sino-Japanese War revealed a truth that chilled China. The reforms of the self-strengthening movement had not gone far enough. The Qing Navy, once considered modern, was swiftly defeated. Chinese armies, hampered by corruption and poor coordination, faltered. The Treaty of Shimonoseki forced China to cede Taiwan, recognize Korea's independence, and pay a heavy indemnity. For the people, this loss was a profound humiliation. For centuries, China had considered itself the Middle Kingdom, the central power of Asia. Now, it had been bested not by a Western giant, but by a neighbor once deemed insignificant. And still, within the heart of China, opium lingered as a quiet enemy. While gunboats and treaties captured headlines, the slow erosion caused by addiction weakened society from within. Villages, once vibrant with the sound of plows and children's laughter, sometimes fell eerily quiet. Farmers pawned their tools for another pipe's worth. Young men who might have defended their homeland wasted away in smoky dens. Foreign observers wrote of this dual tragedy, China's external defeats and its internal decay. Missionaries, scholars, and travelers described towns filled with contrasts. Towering pagodas beside Western-built factories, opium dens beside schools teaching calculus and chemistry. Some sympathized deeply with the suffering, others judged harshly, but all recognized that China stood at a crossroads. Within the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager Cixi maintained her grip, even as critics whispered that her conservatism stifled the reforms needed for survival. Reformers pleaded for railways, modern education, constitutional limits on power. But every proposal clashed with entrenched traditions and the fear of losing identity altogether. Thus, the dynasty wavered. Caught between worlds, the ancient order it sought to preserve, and the modern reality pressing relentlessly against its gates. The loss to Japan in 1895 shook China to its core. Intellectuals across the empire began to question not just the dynasty, but the very traditions that had guided society for centuries. If Confucian ideals had built the Middle Kingdom, why had they failed to protect it now? If scholars and officials clung to ritual and poetry, but neglected science and industry, could the empire truly endure in a changing world? These doubts gave rise to new voices. Reformers like Kang Yue and Liang Qichao spoke passionately of reshaping China modern schools, new laws, parliamentary systems. They looked to the West, and even to Japan, for inspiration. Their writings spread among students and young officials, sparking both hope and alarm. Yet for the common people, daily life remained entangled with opium. Despite government edicts, the drug was so deeply rooted in commerce and habit that it was nearly impossible to eradicate. Taxes on opium provided revenue for local governments, making suppression a contradiction. Families cursed its presence, yet relied on its trade. In this way, the poison and the state became tragically intertwined. Opium dens were described in haunting detail by travelers. They spoke of dim rooms where men reclined on wooden couches, their faces pale, their limbs slack, the smoke curling in delicate ribbons toward the rafters. Some likened it to a dream world, where all ambition melted into nothingness. Others saw only decay, a quiet surrender of human spirit, and yet not all was despair. In bustling ports, Chinese entrepreneurs embraced new industries: cotton mills, printing presses, even newspapers. In coastal cities, students pored over translations of Western works, debating philosophy and politics in tea houses. There was vitality and vision growing alongside decline. At the heart of the empire, Empress Dowager Cixi faced mounting pressure. Reformers pressed urgently for change. Conservatives clung fiercely to tradition, and foreign powers circled like wolves. In 1898, the 100 Days Reform attempted sweeping transformation. Schools restructured, examinations modernized, bureaucracy reshaped. But it ended swiftly, crushed by conservative backlash, leaving reformers in exile or execution. The empire's fragile hope flickered, like a candle threatened by a gust of wind. The dawn of the 20th century arrived like a restless tide. The Qing Dynasty still stood, but its strength was a shadow of its former glory. Foreign powers had carved concessions into Chinese soil. Britain in Hong Kong, France in the south, Germany in Shandong, Russia in Manchuria. Railroads crisscrossed the land, not built by the empire itself, but by foreign investors who profited from China's weakness. For ordinary people, the signs of foreign presence were everywhere. Foreign soldiers marching through treaty ports, foreign banks controlling silver, foreign missionaries preaching their faith. Pride, once rooted in the grandeur of the Middle Kingdom, was pierced daily by reminders of lost sovereignty. Opium, too, remained woven into this landscape. Despite repeated campaigns to curb its use, addiction lingered stubbornly. The drug had become not merely an import, but a domestic industry. Chinese growers cultivated vast fields of poppies, their crimson blossoms swaying beneath the sun, beautiful yet ominous. Profits enticed landlords and officials alike, ensuring the cycle continued. But resistance grew. Scholars and reformers began to frame opium not just as a personal vice, but as a national wound. To free China from foreign dominance, they argued, the people must free themselves from the drug that dulled their strength. Essays and speeches urged families to abandon the pipe, framing sobriety as an act of patriotism. At the same time, secret societies flourished, their members bound by oaths to restore China's dignity. Some were driven by loyalty to tradition, others by revolutionary zeal. In smoky tea houses and hidden halls, they whispered of uprisings, of driving out foreigners, of building a new China from the ashes of the old. The court, under Empress Dowager Cixi, sought to hold the balance. She allowed limited reforms, modern schools, new armies trained in foreign styles, but always kept tight control, wary of losing her grip. Yet time itself seemed to be slipping from her hands. Amid these tensions, a storm was brewing. It was not only opium that drained the empire, nor only foreign treaties that humiliated it, but also the rising anger of its own people. That anger, silent for decades, was preparing to erupt. The storm that gathered at the turn of the century took shape in the form of the Boxer Rebellion. It began with secret societies in northern China, groups that called themselves the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. Two foreign observers, or simply boxers, known for their martial rituals and belief in spiritual protection. They rose not only against foreigners, but also against the creeping influence of Christianity and the opium trade that hollowed their land. To the Boxers, the empire had been weakened by outside corruption, and it was time for the spirits of ancestors and the strength of common people to cleanse it. Villages became training grounds, where young men practiced rituals, chanting incantations, and moving in fierce unison beneath banners painted with protective charms. They believed that bullets would bounce harmlessly from their bodies, that ancestral spirits guided their blades. Fueled by desperation, poverty, and a burning desire to reclaim dignity, their ranks swelled quickly. The rebellion spread like wildfire. Foreign missionaries and converts became targets. Railway tracks and telegraph lines, symbols of foreign intrusion, were torn up and destroyed. In Beijing, the presence of the Boxers stirred both fear and hope. To some, they were protectors of tradition. To others, they were reckless forces inviting catastrophe. Empress Dowager Cixi, ever calculating, at first hesitated, but as the movement grew, she threw her support behind them, declaring war on foreign powers in 1900. It was a bold, desperate gamble. The response from the world was swift, an alliance of 8 nations: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, the United States, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary sent armies marching into China. Modern rifles, artillery, and disciplined troops clashed with the Boxers' fervor. The imbalance was overwhelming. Villages burned, cities fell, and Beijing itself was stormed. The aftermath was devastating. The Boxer Protocol of 1901 imposed crushing indemnities, demanded executions of officials, and stationed foreign troops within China's capital. The dynasty had gambled with rebellion and lost disastrously. For the people, the rebellion left scars deeper than the battles. Crops had been destroyed, taxes increased, and the opium trade endured through it all. The dream of cleansing the land had dissolved into another bitter humiliation, another weight upon the fragile empire. In the wake of the Boxer Rebellion, China stood bruised and exhausted. The empire had survived, but only just. Foreign troops lingered in Beijing, their presence an ever-present reminder of the dynasty's diminished sovereignty. The indemnities demanded by the Boxer Protocol weighed heavily upon the treasury, draining silver that might have fed the hungry or rebuilt the countryside. In the provinces, the people bore the burden most keenly. Taxes rose, labor was extracted, and bitterness deepened. Villagers who once turned to rebellion now found themselves crushed between poverty and a dynasty too weak to protect them. The opium trade, though occasionally challenged, still threaded its way through the land, its crimson blossoms blooming defiantly across fields. Yet even in these troubled times, seeds of change continued to sprout. Reform-minded officials, humbled by repeated defeats, realized that piecemeal efforts would not suffice. Schools began to abandon the old imperial examinations. Shifting toward modern curriculum, mathematics, science, political theory, young men traveled abroad to Japan, to Europe, even to America, carrying back visions of republics and constitutions. In tea houses and courtyards, debates echoed. Should China cling to its Confucian roots, or embrace Western models entirely? Could tradition and progress be blended, or must one give way to the other? These questions stirred not only scholars, but farmers, merchants, and artisans alike. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people found their voices joining the chorus of change. Though advanced in age, her political instincts were as sharp as ever. She initiated belated reforms, including attempts to modernize the army and establish new institutions. Yet these measures came too late to reverse the tide. The empire's losses and humiliations had already undermined its legitimacy. Opium, meanwhile, symbolized the paradox of the age. It was condemned as poison, yet tolerated for the revenue it provided. It was denounced as a foreign curse, yet cultivated domestically. For many families, it was both a source of ruin and a means of survival. The duality of opium mirrored the duality of the empire itself, torn between old and new, survival and decay. As the 20th century advanced, whispers of revolution grew louder, echoing across fields, cities, and schools. The dynasty's end was drawing near, though it still clung to the fragile remnants of its once mighty power. By the early years of the 1900s, the Qing Dynasty stood like a fading silhouette, still present, but lacking the brilliance that once illuminated the world. The reforms initiated after the Boxer defeat continued, but they carried the weight of desperation rather than vision. The imperial examination system, long the backbone of Chinese governance, was abolished in 1905. For centuries, scholars had devoted their lives to memorizing Confucian classics, their success or failure determining the fate of entire families. Now, that ancient path was closed. In its place, modern schools arose, teaching science, law, and political theory. It was a profound shift, severing one of the oldest ties to China's traditions. Young students who studied abroad returned with fiery ideas. Some were inspired by Japan's modernization, believing that if a neighbor could transform into a global power, so could China. Others absorbed the philosophies of Euro-republicanism, socialism, and nationalism. These new visions spread rapidly, carried by newspapers, pamphlets, and passionate voices in crowded tea houses. Yet the empire still bore heavy chains. The indemnities from past wars drained its treasury. Foreign railroads carved through its soil. Concessions within its cities stood as daily reminders that sovereignty was fractured. Too many, the Qing dynasty seemed powerless to reverse the tide. Opium remained a festering wound. By now, both the government and the people recognized its destructive power. But eradication was no simple task. Local officials relied on taxes from opium fields to fund their administrations. Families depended on its cultivation for survival. Though campaigns against it were launched, the drug's grip was too deep. its roots intertwined with every layer of society. And still, in the midst of decline, resilience flickered. Farmers sowed their fields with rice and wheat. Artisans carved wood and fired porcelain. Poets composed verses about mountains and rivers. Life continued, stubbornly, beautifully, even as dynastic power waned. In the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager, Cixi, neared the end of her reign. Old, but formidable, she remained a symbol of tradition, even as the world outside demanded change. With her passing in 1908, a door quietly closed on an era that had lasted for centuries. What lay beyond would be turbulent, uncertain, and transformative. The Qing Dynasty was nearing its twilight. The year 1908 marked a turning point, the death of the Empress Dowager Cixi, and only a day earlier, the death of the Guangxu Emperor. The throne passed to a child Pu, not yet 3 years old. A toddler now bore the title of Son of Heaven, ruler of millions. The empire, already fragile, seemed even more precarious in such small hands. Behind the gilded walls of the Forbidden City, regents governed in the child's name, but their authority was questioned at every turn. Provincial leaders, armed with modern armies and ambitious visions, began to think less of loyalty to the throne and more of their own power. The unity of the empire was splintering. Meanwhile, outside those palace walls, change quickened. Students returned from abroad with sharper ideas, forming societies dedicated to revolution. Among them was Sun Yat-sen, a figure who dreamed not of patching the dynasty but of replacing it entirely with a republic. His writings spread like sparks, igniting hope in some and fear in others. The common people, though less concerned with political theory, felt the tremors in their daily lives. Famines, floods, and rising taxes continued. Foreign influence remained visible in ports and railways. The opium problem lingered as both a curse and an open wound. Efforts to eradicate it grew more determined now, framed as part of a larger struggle for national renewal. But in practice, many still succumbed to its haze, finding escape from hardship in the swirling smoke. For those addicted, the pipe offered brief illusions of comfort. Yet for the empire, every puff represented time lost, energy drained, and willpower weakened. Reformers saw this clearly. They spoke of opium as more than a drug. It was a symbol of how foreign intrusion had unmade the empire, and how complacency had allowed decay to spread unchecked. By now, whispers of rebellion were no longer whispers. Secret societies plotted openly, uprisings broke out sporadically, and provincial armies often stood idle, uncertain whether to crush or to join them. The empire was unraveling thread by thread, its centuries of dominance giving way to restless new forces. And so, on the horizon, the final collapse of the Qing began to take shape, like the first light of dawn after a long, troubled night. By 1910, the Qing dynasty stood on its last fragile legs. Decades of humiliation, foreign intrusion, and internal weakness had left the empire hollow. The people, once bound by reverence for the Son of Heaven, now looked elsewhere for hope. In the south, revolutionary groups gained strength. They spoke of nationalism, of reclaiming sovereignty, of ending the dynasty that had failed to shield China from opium and foreign domination. Sun Yat-sen emerged as a unifying figure, charismatic, idealistic, and determined to see a republic rise from the ruins of monarchy. His vision was simple, yet profound. A government of the people, not of a single dynasty. The opium problem remained woven into this drama. Reformers saw it not only as a health crisis, but as a symbol of all that had weakened China. They argued that a nation shackled by addiction could never stand strong against outsiders. Pamphlets called upon families to burn their pipes, to plant grain instead of poppies, to restore vigor to the land. Some heeded the call, while others, worn by poverty, could not let go of the one crop that brought survival. Meanwhile, within the Forbidden City, young Pui played with toys and servants, unaware of the weight of history pressing upon him. His regents tried to enact reforms and haste constitutional assemblies, modern schools, railways, but the moves came too late. The trust of the people had already been lost. The empire's decline was not merely political, it was deeply spiritual. Once the Middle Kingdom had viewed itself as the center of the world, its identity was fractured. Was China to remain tethered to its traditions, or to leap into the modern world, risking the loss of its soul? The question haunted every debate, every reform, every act of defiance. In towns and cities, rumors swirled of revolution. Secret societies organized with greater boldness. Soldiers whispered of switching sides. Ordinary people, tired of taxation and humiliation, began to dream of something different, even if they could not name exactly what it was. And in 1911, that dream erupted into reality. The revolution had begun, and with it, the final unraveling of the empire that opium, war, and misrule had brought to its knees. The revolution of 1911 began with a small spark in Wuchang, city on the Yangtze River. What started as a mutiny among soldiers soon rippled outward, spreading like fire through dry grass. Provinces declared independence, one after another, their officials abandoning the Qing banner in favor of a new idea, the Republic of China. For centuries, loyalty to the dynasty had been the thread stitching society together. Now, that thread snapped. By the end of the year, much of the empire no longer answered to the Forbidden City. The fall that had seemed unthinkable just a generation earlier was happening with astonishing speed. Opium, once smuggled in by foreign merchants, had long since become a metaphor in revolutionary speeches. It dulled our strength, they said. It weakened our will. It made us servants when we should have been free. This rhetoric resonated deeply, especially with the younger generation who yearned to restore pride. To them, breaking free of opium meant breaking free of everything. It symbolized foreign control, dynastic weakness, and submission. The last dowager regents pleaded for negotiations. Ministers argued endlessly in the palace halls, some desperate to save the throne, others resigned to its inevitable collapse. Finally, in early 1912, the abdication edict was issued. The boy Emperor Pui, not yet 7 years old, was removed from power, his reign ending before it had truly begun. The dynasty that had ruled since 1644 was gone. The Qing, who had once expanded China's borders to their greatest extent, who had governed through opulence, in strict order, had been undone by corruption, rebellion, and above all the poison of opium that hollowed the state from within. The Republic of China was proclaimed, fragile yet full of promise. Firecrackers were set off in the streets of Nanjing and Beijing. Banners of revolution fluttered in the cold air. Yet the scars of the past did not vanish overnight. Opium dens still existed, addicts still suffered, and foreign merchants still eyed the country hungrily. But for many, there was hope of belief that at last, China might heal, that the centuries of humiliation might give way to renewal. Whether this hope would endure was uncertain, yet in that moment, as fireworks lit the skies, people dared to believe in a future free of chains. In the early years of the Republic, the legacy of opium lingered like a shadow. Even though revolutionaries promised reform, the substance that had weakened an empire did not disappear easily.
Warlords.
Each ruling their territories with armies of loyal soldiers, often relied on opium taxation to fund their regimes. Fields once used for grain or cotton were planted with poppies, and caravans carried the resin through mountain passes, sustaining conflict and power struggles. Ordinary families still suffered. A father, unable to resist the craving, would sell heirlooms to buy another pipe's worth. A mother would water down rice porridge so her children could eat, because too much of the household income vanished into the haze of smoke. The Republic promised change, yet for many, daily life still bore the imprint of the empire's great wound. Intellectuals of the time wrote essays filled with urgency. They called opium the national shame, and urged their fellow citizens to abandon it, framing the struggle against the drug as inseparable from the struggle for sovereignty. If China is to rise, they wrote, the smoke must vanish from our halls. Newspapers printed harrowing illustrations. Emaciated men slumped in dens. Contrasted with visions of strong, healthy farmers tilling the land, the message was clear: redemption lay in sobriety. Foreign powers, though, still had stakes in the trade. Some companies, deeply entrenched, continued to profit from the demand. Though treaties had been revised and rhetoric shifted, the temptation to exploit remained. Ships still sailed, not always with legitimate goods. In some ports, whispers of corruption ensured the trade persisted in secret. But alongside these struggles came small victories. Local officials organized public burnings of opium pipes, ceremonies meant to signal moral renewal. Young activists went door to door urging families to destroy their stashes. Clinics began to appear, offering herbal remedies and slow withdrawal methods for addicts. The process was painful, but some succeeded in breaking free. Their lives slowly mended. For the people, the collapse of the Qing had brought both relief and uncertainty. The old chains were broken, but new struggles replaced them. Yet, for every addict lost in the haze, there was also someone who woke each morning determined to live differently. To see their children grow strong in a world no longer burdened by an empire's addiction. As the Republic entered its second decade, opium remained both a symbol and a battlefield. Reformers began to realize that to free the nation from its grasp, it would not be enough to pass edicts or burn pipes. They needed to change the very fabric of society, to replace despair with purpose and weakness with strength. Schools became a central part of this effort. Teachers reminded children that their grandparents had lived through humiliation, the sight of foreign soldiers marching through Beijing, the sting of treaties signed under duress. They told them that opium was not just a drug, it was a chain, and that the next generation must be the one to break it completely. Children repeated pledges in classrooms, to learn, to work, to remain clean of the smoke. Meanwhile, cultural movements swept through cities. Playwrights wrote tragedies where opium destroyed noble families, ending in sorrow. Poets contrasted the clouded gaze of the addict with the bright eyes of the awakened patriot. Artists painted posters showing strong farmers scattering seeds of grain instead of poppies, their fields golden and lush beneath the sun. Everywhere, imagery tried to recast opium as a mark of shame, a weakness to be overcome for the sake of national pride. Yet even in this atmosphere, the drug's grip proved stubborn. Warlords continued to enrich themselves by taxing its cultivation, and some communities, desperate for survival, saw no other crop that could bring money as quickly. Foreign smugglers exploited these weaknesses, ensuring demand was never fully extinguished. Still, the tide was slowly turning. New medical associations introduced scientific treatments, offering substitutes and gradual detoxification regimens. Urban clinics became places of both suffering and hope where shaking hands tried to steady themselves, where dreams of renewal seemed possible. Stories spread of men who had once been ruined by smoke, now strong again, working, providing for their families. These tales became inspiration, proof that healing, though difficult, was not impossible. The Republic itself was fragile, shaken by internal divisions and looming foreign interests. Yet in the hearts of ordinary people, the dream of a stronger China persisted. They longed for a time when the skies above would no longer be dimmed by the smoke of dens, but would instead open clear and bright, unburdened by the legacy of the empire's great affliction. By the 1920s, China was caught between old wounds and new aspirations. The opium crisis lingered, but alongside it, modern movements of reform and nationalism grew louder. Young students gathered in universities, debating philosophy, politics, and the very soul of their nation. For them, breaking free from opium was not just about health, it was about identity. It's about reclaiming dignity after generations of subjugation. The May 4th movement of 1919 had already stirred the nation, filling the air with the spirit of resistance against both foreign domination and internal decay. Pamphlets circulated declaring that China must awaken, that every puff of opium smoke was a surrender of will, a betrayal of ancestors. In tea houses, speakers raised their voices to urge people to choose clarity over haze, strength over weakness. In rural villages, life was more complex. Families who had farmed poppies for generations found themselves torn between necessity and patriotism. The crop was lucrative, feeding hungry mouths when other harvests failed. To abandon it meant facing starvation. To continue meant feeding the very poison that crippled the nation. Many wrestled with this moral dilemma, torn between survival and the greater good. Foreign powers, too, still played their games. While treaties outlawed the trade in principle, loopholes and corruption ensured that profits flowed quietly into the hands of those willing to look away. Ships still docked in secret harbors, crates still changed hands under moonlight. The dream of a fully sober nation remained just out of reach. Yet amidst these shadows, rays of hope pierced through. Medical students trained in Western medicine and traditional practices alike began to experiment with treatments. Some villages organized collective efforts to destroy poppy fields, replacing them with rice or wheat. Communities celebrated these acts with festivals, lanterns strung up to mark the beginning of a new, cleaner future. Even literature began to reflect this yearning. Novels spoke of families divided by addiction, of heroes who swore to cleanse the nation's body and soul. Readers wept at the tragedies, but also found courage in the stories of redemption. Through art, China sought to write a new destiny, one in which opium no longer defined its path. The journey was far from complete, but step by step, people were learning to resist the chains that had once bound their empire, determined to carve out a tomorrow unclouded by smoke. By the late 1920s, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek began to confront the opium problem directly. Their struggle was not merely against the drug itself, but against the networks of power and corruption that sustained it. Warlords, local officials, and secret societies all had their share in the trade. To dismantle this web required not only laws, but also force and the will to endure resistance. Campaigns were launched to eradicate opium fields. Soldiers were dispatched to burn poppy crops, their torches lighting up the night skies of rural provinces. Families who had depended on the crop cried as their livelihoods went up in flames, yet officials promised new opportunities. New seeds for grains and cotton, subsidies to ease the transition. Government proclaimed that a healthier nation would rise from these ashes. But as with all ambitious reforms, the results were uneven. Some provinces obeyed, while others quietly continued cultivation under the protection of local leaders who profited too much to give it up. Smugglers adapted, shifting routes through mountains and rivers, using clever disguises and bribes to slip past checkpoints. For every den shuttered in the city, another seemed to spring up in a hidden alley. Still, progress was visible. Newspapers printed photographs of public bonfires, where confiscated pipes, scales, and boxes of the drug were destroyed. Crowds gathered to watch, cheering as flames consumed the symbols of their suffering. In schools, students raised slogans. A strong nation is a clean nation. The message echoed from village walls to university halls. Internationally, too, the fight against opium was gaining momentum. Conferences were held, agreements signed, as nations sought to regulate and suppress the trade. China, once forced into treaties that legitimized the poison, now stood as a vocal advocate for its eradication. The irony was, sharp what had once been imposed upon them, they now sought to abolish for the world. And yet beneath this determined struggle, the scars of the past remained raw. Families carried memories of loved ones lost to addiction. Generations had grown up in households clouded with smoke, their stories etched with both pain and endurance. To heal such wounds would take not years but decades. Still, with each field destroyed, with each addict who found the courage to recover, the dream of freedom from opium edged closer. As the 1930s arrived, China's battle with opium reached a critical stage. The nationalist government's resolve hardened, declaring that the very survival of the nation depended on defeating this poison. Chiang Kai-shek and his wife Sun Mei-ling became vocal leaders of the anti-opium crusade. To them, the campaign was more than policy. It was a mission to restore moral strength to a fractured country. The government introduced strict regulations, attempting to centralize control. Licensed addicts were registered, required to undergo gradual detoxification under supervision. Clinics multiplied in cities, offering controlled doses and step-by-step weaning methods. Harsh penalties were imposed on traffickers, sometimes even execution, to send a message that the age of indulgence was ending. Yet enforcement was uneven, challenged by corruption and by the sheer scale of the trade. Entire villages still depended on poppy cultivation, their soil rich with the plant that had brought both sustenance and ruin. Local officials, torn between duty and survival, often turned a blind eye. The paradox remained. To save the nation, one had to starve the very communities that had fed it for centuries. Still, propaganda became a powerful weapon. Posters appeared in towns showing strong, sober workers contrasted with the slumped figure of the addict. Films portrayed tragic tales of families destroyed by the drug, urging audiences to reject the smoke and embrace discipline. Public spectacles of destruction where thousands of pipes were shattered. Opium balls ground into dust became ritualistic acts of cleansing. And yet, just as the struggle seemed to gain momentum, new storms gathered on the horizon. Japan's aggression in Manchuria and beyond created instability, draining resources and focus. In occupied territories, the Japanese themselves manipulated the opium trade, using it as a tool to weaken Chinese resistance. Addiction became not only a domestic tragedy, but also a weapon wielded by invaders. The people bore this double burden, fighting for independence, while also struggling against the remnants of a poison that had shaped their lives for generations. In the quiet corners of cities, families still lit pipes in secret, hiding from officials. In mountain passes, caravans still carried contraband under the cover of darkness. But in the hearts of many, the vision of a future free from opium still flickered like a stubborn flame, refusing to be extinguished. By the mid-1930s, the campaign against opium was reaching both its peak and its greatest test. The nationalist government pressed harder than ever, determined to root out the trade from every corner of the country. Chiang Kai-shek framed it as a moral war, one that could determine whether China would rise again or remain shackled by its past. Special bureaus were created to monitor cultivation, transport, and sale. Police units raided dens with increasing frequency, dragging addicts into clinics or prisons. In some cities, the crackdown was so intense that the familiar sweet-sick smell of burning opium seemed to vanish overnight. Too many, it felt like the dawn of a new era. Yet beyond the reach of central authority, shadows remained. Warlords who still held sway in remote provinces clung to the trade as their lifeline. Secret societies with their underground networks adapted like smoke itself, slipping through cracks, reforming where pressure eased. Smugglers disguised their shipments as tea, silk, or medicine. For every den that was closed, another hidden one seemed to open. Meanwhile, the global conversation around opium was changing. International conferences convened, and China took a proud role in pushing for worldwide restrictions. Delegates spoke passionately, reminding other nations that it had been foreign greed, once legitimized by canon and treaty, that had unleashed the plague upon their land. Now, they said, we must work together to ensure no nation suffers as China has suffered. These speeches won respect, a small measure of redemption after decades of humiliation. But inside China, new struggles made the anti-opium fight fragile. The looming conflict with Japan consumed resources, manpower, and political will. In occupied regions, Japanese authorities cynically encouraged the trade, allowing opium to flood markets as a tool of subjugation. Resistance fighters whispered bitterly that, while they fought with rifles and courage, their enemies fought also with powder and smoke, weakening their people from within. Still, the government's campaign planted seeds of change. Clinics, though underfunded, helped thousands take their first steps toward recovery. Villages that had once planted poppies now sowed rice or cotton, finding slow but steady alternatives. And in the hearts of a generation growing up in the 1930s, there was pride in resisting not only foreign invaders, but also the poison that had once enslaved their ancestors. As the late 1930s unfolded, China faced one of its darkest chapters. The Second Sino-Japanese War erupted in 1937, drawing the nation into a desperate struggle for survival. Amid bombings, scorched earth, and mass displacement, the battle against opium seemed to fade into the background. Yet paradoxically, the drug did not vanish, became both a curse and a weapon. Japanese forces occupying vast regions of China exploited opium deliberately. They encouraged cultivation in conquered territories, flooding local markets with cheap supplies. The intention was clear: to weaken resistance by sapping strength from within. In cities under occupation, opium dens reappeared with grim regularity, often licensed by puppet authorities who profited from despair. The same smoke that had once symbolized foreign exploitation returned, now as part of a new invader's strategy. For resistance groups, this reality was bitter. They struggled not only to fight with dwindling weapons and supplies, but also to prevent their people from slipping back into addiction. Guerrilla leaders issued strict orders. Opium fields found in liberated zones were to be burned no matter the cost. Villagers, though torn between hunger and loyalty, often complied, believing that sacrifice was necessary to preserve the nation's spirit. Meanwhile, in areas still controlled by the nationalist government, the anti-opium campaign continued in whatever capacity war allowed. Resources were scarce, and the focus was survival against invasion. Yet officials still staged public burnings, still printed posters reminding citizens that smoke in the lungs meant weakness on the battlefield. The slogan transformed. Resisting opium was equated with resisting Japan. In the shadows, however, the trade persisted. Desperate soldiers, civilians displaced from their homes, and corrupt middlemen ensured that demand never vanished. A tragic cycle unfolded. Those seeking escape from war's horrors sometimes turned to the very drug that had long haunted their nation. And yet, amid destruction, a remarkable resilience endured. Stories emerged of families who, even in the ruins of bombed-out villages, refused to allow opium back into their homes. Mothers hid pipes from sons, elders told cautionary tales by the light of makeshift lamps, warning that surrendering to smoke was surrendering to the enemy itself. In this way, the struggle against opium merged completely with the larger war for survival. Both battles were against forces that sought to enslave, and both required extraordinary strength to resist. By the early 1940s, the struggle with opium had become inseparable from the broader conflict consuming China. The war with Japan raged across cities and countrysides, and though guns and bombs drew most attention, the quieter war against smoke and powder still persisted in the background. The nationalist government, now headquartered in Chongqing, continued to declare opium eradication a pillar of its mission. Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Sung Meilang, delivered impassioned speeches to both Chinese citizens and foreign allies, insisting that a new, healthy China must rise from the ashes of war. She spoke not only of soldiers and strategy, but of discipline, of cleansing the nation from the poisons of the past. Her voice, calm yet firm, carried across radios into homes where people longed for hope. Resistance zones, controlled by the communists in the north, also adopted strict anti-opium policies. Mao Zedong and his commanders viewed addiction as incompatible with revolutionary discipline. In their territories, poppy fields were uprooted with uncompromising force, and addicts were pushed into harsh programs to break free from dependence. Though methods were severe, the goal was clear. The Red Army could not afford to be weakened by the haze of smoke. Thus, in both nationalist and communist zones, despite all their rivalries, a rare unity of purpose emerged. Opium was the enemy of a free China. The drug, which had once been legitimized by treaties and protected by foreign powers, was now universally condemned as a national shame. Yet for the ordinary people, war made everything more complicated. Displaced families wandered from province to province, often encountering the temptation of opium along the way. Some found solace in it, unable to endure the grief of losing homes or loved ones. Others resisted, clinging to the belief that survival meant not only living through the war, but living clean of the poison that had haunted their ancestors. In secret, smugglers continued their work. Along remote mountain trails, under the cover of night, caravans carried hidden bundles, slipping past patrols. Even as governments cracked down, the profit was too tempting, the demand too enduring. Still, through hardship and chaos, the image of a brighter, unclouded China remained alive. It lingered like a quiet promise that when the war was over, when peace finally returned, the smoke would fade, and the nation would at last breathe freely. By the mid-1940s, the Second World War was drawing to a close, and China faced both relief and new challenges. The Japanese occupation was ending, but the nation remained scarred by decades of conflict. Foreign exploitation and centuries of opium's shadow. The fight against addiction had been relentless, yet stubborn remnants of the trade still lingered in isolated areas. The nationalist government renewed its commitment to eradicating opium entirely. Enforcement became more systematic, with officials tasked specifically to monitor rural districts and cities alike. Entire villages underwent inspections, poppy fields were burned, and addicts were enrolled in rehabilitation programs. The government framed this as both a moral and patriotic duty. Freedom from opium equated to the strength needed to rebuild the nation. In liberated territories, the communist forces also strengthened their anti-opium campaigns. They viewed addiction as a tool of oppression, historically used by invaders and corrupt officials to weaken the population. Children were educated to reject the drug, families were organized to uproot poppies, and public demonstrations celebrated the destruction of opium dens. The emphasis was on community vigilance, collective responsibility, and moral renewal. Yet the legacy of opium was deeply entrenched. Many families had relied on poppy cultivation for generations. Older addicts carried scars of long-term use, both physical and emotional. Even as younger generations learned to resist, the memories of poverty, subjugation, and loss lingered in every household. The international community, too, played a role. Agreements from the League of Nations and later the United Nations encouraged countries to curtail the opium trade, signaling global support for China's domestic campaigns. Ships that had once brought opium into Chinese ports were now monitored closely, and smugglers faced increasing legal pressure. Despite these efforts, the process of recovery was slow. Rural areas still faced poverty and instability, making the temptation of the poppy ever present. Addiction, after centuries of entrenchment, could not be eradicated overnight. But hope persisted. Clinics offered treatment, schools promoted sobriety, and stories of recovered addicts inspired others. Through it all, the people of China moved forward, determined to free themselves from the chains of the past. Step by step, field by field, family by family, the nation reclaimed its strength and dignity, carrying the memory of opium not as a curse, but as a lesson from which to grow stronger.